Chapter 25, The Great Depression. Section 1, The End of Prosperity. Let's start talking about the stock market. In the 1920s, the stock market was a bull market. That's what we call a stock market that has rising stock values. So lots of people were rushing out to buy stocks. Some could not afford to buy stocks at full price, so they started to buy these stocks on something called buying on margin, which means purchasing on credit. So let's say, as you can see in the picture here, you have a Google stock that costs $500, and if you're buying on margin, you pay $150, and then you would owe the rest, $350, on credit. So you would pay that gradually as your stock maybe got better. You could start paying off that loan that you got. The stock market was at its highest peak in the summer of 1929, but then prices started to drop. And ordinarily, that shouldn't be cause of concern. But that started a continual drop, which led to something called a bear market. That's when the price starts to drop in stocks. So people who had invested money to buy a stock are starting to sell their stocks. And they're selling their stocks so they can pay out the loans that they owed because they bought on margin. In September of 1929, the total value of all stocks was $87 billion. On Thursday, October 24th, that's roughly a month later, panic hit the stock market when stocks lost $11 billion in just 3 hours. That's a lot of money. So it was a drastic drop. And so everyone started to sell their stocks. Prices continued to drop on Monday. Then on Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. That means there was no money, if you will, to sell, and that became known as Black Tuesday. So many people wanted to sell, but no one wanted to buy. That's what made the stock market crash or collapse. So the whole point of the stock market is you're constantly moving money in and out. People buy, sell, but then they reinvest the money into another stock. But people were just selling, and they weren't buying, which caused the collapse. By the end of November 1929, $30 billion worth of stock value disappeared. Banks lost heavily on their investments because customers could not pay back bank loans. So banks, of course, lent out money to people to purchase stocks, and then those people couldn't pay back their stocks. Plus, banks were also investing the money that was in the bank in the stock market as well. And so they lost their money as well. So some banks did go out of business, of course, losing people's savings. The public started to panic and rushed to the banks to withdraw their money. However, when they got to the banks were out of money. And to see how this works is when you deposit your money, it kind of goes into a pool. And so your money might be given to someone else, but they keep track of how much you put into the bank. So there's only so much money that's in the actual building itself. The rest of it might be sent to who knows where, to like the safety deposit or whatever. But the point is, people came to the banks to get their money, and there wasn't any money because A, the banks loaned out a lot of the money, and B, they invested money into the stock market. More banks closed. Over 2,200 banks closed in 1931 alone. Some businesses lost their savings and were forced to close. So businesses were investing in the stock market. When the stock market tanked, their savings were gone too. Others were forced to cut back on the production that they normally did, and that resulted in job loss. When you're not producing as much as you normally do, you have to cut workers. Unemployment soared to more than 4 million workers. So if we're looking at this chart here, it's showing you the height of unemployment during the Depression. And, President Hoover was the president at the time when it started. It reached a peak in Hoover's term right after FDR took over at about 25%. That's huge numbers of unemployment. And then it started to creep down with FDR. And we're going to try to explain some of the reasons why there was this thing called a Great Depression. That's mainly because of a business cycle. The business cycle is the rhythm in which an economy expands and contracts its production. So if you look at the little diagram here, you start with the prosperity, everything's great, low interest rates, high employment, positive attitudes, and then you hit a recession. A recession is lower employment, some inflation, and interest rates rising. You hit a depression when there's high unemployment and no money in the economy. And then you start to recover and it's back up to prosperity. That's the business cycle. The economy did not recover from the downturn, so when it hit a recession, it didn't recover and continued to go down, and that's when the Great Depression began. Causes of the Depression. First, government's monetary policy. Second, overproduction is when businesses produce far more goods than people buy. An uneven distribution of wealth, meaning there's more poor people than there are rich people, and declining world trade, because the Depression was happening not just in the United States but all over the world. Let's go back to overproduction for a second, and I'll give you an example. I bought one of the first Walkmans. Now, maybe you don't know what a Walkman is, but it was this little box you put a cassette tape in and you played music and you had the headphones. It was really cool. And when Walkmans first came out, they were really expensive. So with my first job, I saved up my money and I bought a Walkman. Now, as more and more people were able to afford Walkmans, the price went down on the Walkmans because more and more people have them and more people aren't buying them, so the price went down. That's what overproduction is all about. President Hoover's reaction. Hoover didn't believe that it was the federal government's role to provide direct relief to people, but he did create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that loaned $1.2 billion to financial institutions, but he did not want to support individuals. Americans were angry at the response of President Hoover. I mean, makes sense. You're not doing well and government refuses to help you out. And so they blame Hoover for the Great Depression. Whether it was really him or not, they blamed President Hoover for this. And so lots of people who lost their homes because of losing all their money started to build these temporary shacks called Hoovervilles. They were built from groups of tin and cardboard shacks, so it's like a little mini homeless shelter kind of area. And because they didn't like Hoover, they called them Hoovervilles. Another issue arose with something called the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army were a bunch of World War I veterans who were promised a bonus, and that bonus was supposed to come like 25 years after they got out of the military after World War I. Well, because many of them had lost their, everything, they were demanding their military bonuses come early. And so they walked to Washington, D.C., and they protested. They built their own little Hoovervilles outside of the White House. They were going to move till they get their bonus payments. So President Hoover authorized the use of force to remove the Bonus Army from in front of the White House, led by a man named Douglas MacArthur. They will use force, and some of it was deadly force, in removing the Bonus Army. So that sank Hoover's popularity further down the drain. So Herbert Hoover is up for re-election in 1932, and part of his campaigning was that he believed that democratic aid packages would weaken American spirit of self-reliance. He really felt like it was up to the people to get themselves out of the desperate times that they were in. Now, if you're a poor person or a person who lost everything due to the stock market crash, that's really probably something you don't want to hear. Now, the Democratic candidate was a guy named Franklin Roosevelt, and he had this tons of confidence, and he was very optimistic about what was going to happen to Americans, and that really appealed to the voters of the United States. And so Roosevelt will win the 1932 election in a landslide. That ends Section 1.